September 14th, 1991, 3:47 a.m., 43 nautical miles northwest of Sevastopol, Black Sea. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb was descending into absolute darkness when his dive partner stopped moving. Through the murky water, Webb could see Lieutenant James Harrington frozen at 92 meters depth, his headlamp beam fixed on something massive jutting from the seafloor sediment. The steel cylinder gleamed with an almost supernatural quality in the artificial light, sleek, impossibly aerodynamic, and covered in Cyrillic markings that even Webb could recognize as military classification stamps. But it wasn't the torpedo's size that made Harrington stop breathing. It was the sound. A low mechanical hum emanating from somewhere inside the weapon, a sound that shouldn't exist in a device that had been sitting on the ocean floor for the better part of 3 weeks. Webb's heart rate spiked. His breathing accelerated, consuming precious air from his mixed gas supply. Every instinct screamed at him to ascend, to get away from whatever this thing was. But the mission parameters were clear: recovery at all costs. What they didn't know, what no one in American naval intelligence had anticipated, was that this torpedo contained technology so advanced, so fundamentally different from anything the West had developed, that it would force every major navy in the world to completely reimagine underwater warfare. And the clock to recover it was running out. If you find stories like this fascinating, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and click the like icon. It helps more people discover these incredible true stories of courage, technology, and the hidden battles that shaped our world. Now, to understand why 2 American Navy divers found themselves in Soviet territorial waters during one of the most turbulent political moments in Russian history, we need to go back exactly 23 days. August 22nd, 1991. The Soviet Union was collapsing. 3 days earlier, hardline Communist Party members had attempted a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. Tanks had rolled through Moscow. The world held its breath. And while television cameras focused on Boris Yeltsin standing defiantly on a tank outside the Russian parliament, something far more consequential was happening 1,200 miles to the south. In the chaos of the coup attempt, a Soviet Kilo-class submarine, designated VA-111, had departed its base in Sevastopol on what was supposed to be a routine patrol exercise. The submarine's captain, Commander Viktor Petrov, was a 47-year-old career naval officer who had spent his entire adult life serving the Soviet state. But as the coup unfolded and communications from Moscow became increasingly erratic and contradictory, Petrov found himself in an impossible position. His orders came from Admiral Gennady Kvatov, a coup supporter who commanded the Black Sea Fleet. But counter-orders began arriving from officers loyal to Gorbachev. For 72 hours, Petrov maintained radio silence, cruising in circles while his country tore itself apart above the waves. And then, on August 25th, he made a decision that would change everything. At 2:14 in the morning, B-871 conducted what Soviet naval records would later classify as an emergency weapons discharge. A single torpedo was launched from tube number 3. Not at any target, there was no target, but as what Petrov later testified was a test of crew readiness during an uncertain time. That torpedo was a VA-111 Shkval. And it malfunctioned. Now, here's what you need to understand about the Shkval. And this is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. For decades, torpedoes had operated under the same basic physical limitations. Water is dense, water creates drag. The fastest conventional torpedoes in the 1990s could reach speeds of maybe 50 knots, roughly 57 miles per hour. American Mark 48 torpedoes, considered among the best in the world, topped out at around 55 knots. The Shkval traveled at 200 knots. That's 230 miles per hour, underwater. It was, quite literally, 4 times faster than anything the United States Navy had ever developed or even theorized was possible. How do you move that fast through water? The answer was a concept called supercavitation, and the Soviets had been perfecting it in absolute secrecy since 1965. Supercavitation works on a principle that seems almost like science fiction. At extremely high speeds, if you shape an object correctly and inject gas at its nose, you can create a bubble of air around the entire weapon. The torpedo essentially flies through a self-generated air pocket, experiencing almost no water resistance whatsoever. The physics are real. The engineering is real. But in 1991, American scientists had dismissed supercavitation as theoretically interesting but practically impossible. The Soviets proved them catastrophically wrong. Commander Petrov launched his Shkval at 2:14 a.m. on August 25th. The weapon's solid fuel rocket motor ignited correctly. The supercavitation system activated. For approximately 14 seconds, the torpedo performed flawlessly, accelerating to its design speed with terrifying efficiency. And then something went wrong. The guidance system, primitive by later standards using simple gyroscopic controls since the weapon was designed primarily to strike nearby surface targets, experienced a malfunction that caused the torpedo to pitch downward at a steep angle. At 200 knots, there was no recovery. The Shkval dove toward the seafloor, its rocket motor burning until fuel exhaustion approximately 21 seconds after launch. The torpedo buried itself in the sediment at a depth of 97 meters, its warhead failing to detonate, either by design or malfunction. Soviet records are unclear on this point. And there it sat. But here's the critical detail, the detail that would set in motion a chain of events leading directly to Marcus Webb and James Harrington's terrifying dive 3 weeks later. The Shkval's impact was detected. Not by the Soviets. Their attention was elsewhere, focused on the political earthquake reshaping their entire nation. The detection came from an American SSN 688 Los Angeles-class attack submarine, USS Bremerton, which had been conducting surveillance operations in the Black Sea under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. Bremerton's sonar technicians initially classified the contact as a possible missile launch. The acoustic signature was unlike anything in their database, a sustained high-frequency roar followed by a sudden impact with the seafloor. Within hours, that recording was being analyzed at the Naval Ocean Systems Center in San Diego, where a sonar analyst named Patricia Chen made the connection that would change naval warfare forever. "This isn't a missile," she told her supervisor, her voice tight with barely controlled excitement. "Listen to the sustained acoustic profile. This is underwater propulsion. Something hit the water, accelerated to an impossible speed, and then impacted the bottom." Impossible speed? What does that mean? Chen ran the numbers again, triple-checking her calculations against known hydrodynamic principles. Based on the Doppler shift and the distance traveled relative to our time signatures, whatever this was, moved through the water at approximately 170 to 210 knots. Her supervisor stared at her. "That's not possible." "I know," Chen replied. "That's what I'm telling you." The recording was classified cosmic top secret within 24 hours. By August 27th, it had reached the desk of Admiral Frank Kelso, Chief of Naval Operations. By August 29th, President George H.W. Bush had been briefed personally. The United States had discovered, purely by accident, that the Soviet Union possessed a torpedo technology decades ahead of anything the West had developed, a weapon that could strike an aircraft carrier before its defensive systems had time to react, a capability that, if widely deployed, could render the entire American surface fleet vulnerable. The political situation was both a crisis and an opportunity. The Soviet Union was in chaos. Military command structures were fragmenting. The Black Sea Fleet's loyalty was uncertain, with individual commanders taking increasingly independent actions. American intelligence assets in Ukraine reported that portions of the fleet were refusing orders from Moscow, while others were preparing to transfer their allegiance to whatever government eventually emerged from the chaos. In this environment, the decision was made at the highest levels of the American government: recover the Shkval at any cost. The operation was designated Winter Harvest. And that brings us to Marcus Webb. At 34 years old, Chief Petty Officer Webb was one of the Navy's most experienced deep-sea divers. He had conducted recovery operations in the Persian Gulf, retrieved wreckage from aircraft crashes in the Mediterranean, and held depth records that remained classified even within the diving community. His psychological profile noted an unusual tolerance for isolation and physical discomfort, combined with exceptional problem-solving capability under stress. In other words, he was exactly the kind of person you sent when failure was not an option. Webb received his orders on September 8, 1991, at the Naval Amphibious Base in Little Creek, Virginia. The briefing officer was a CIA operations coordinator named David Callahan, who spoke with the kind of deliberate calm that Webb had learned to associate with situations far more dangerous than they initially appeared. "We've located a piece of Soviet military hardware on the floor of the Black Sea," Callahan explained, spreading satellite photographs across the briefing table. "Approximately 43 nautical miles from the Ukrainian coast, depth 97 meters. Your mission is to conduct a detailed examination of the device, photograph all external components, and if feasible, assist in its recovery to the surface." Webb studied the photographs. They showed a distorted sonar image, a cylindrical object partially embedded in seafloor sediment. What kind of hardware are we talking about? "A torpedo, Soviet designation unknown, though we believe it may be from a previously unconfirmed weapons program." "And why am I diving in Soviet territorial waters while the entire country is falling apart around us?" Callahan's expression didn't change. "Because right now, Chief, no one in Moscow knows who's in charge. The Black Sea Fleet is operating essentially independently. Soviet naval command and control has effectively collapsed. If we're ever going to have an opportunity to examine this technology, it's now or never," Webb finished. "Precisely." What Callahan didn't tell Webb, what Webb wouldn't learn until years later, was that the CIA had been planning this exact type of operation for months, waiting for the right combination of circumstances. The Shkval's accidental loss was unexpected, but the infrastructure to exploit exactly such an opportunity had been carefully prepositioned. A converted research vessel, the MV Atlantic Pioneer, had been operating in the eastern Mediterranean for the past 6 months under cover of conducting oceanographic research for a private scientific foundation. In reality, the ship was equipped with a sophisticated sonar system, underwater communications equipment, and a hyperbaric chamber capable of supporting saturation diving operations to depths well beyond 100 meters. The vessel also carried a crew that included 12 Navy SEALs, 4 CIA operations officers, and the most advanced underwater camera systems available to the American intelligence community. By September 10th, Atlantic Pioneer had transited the Turkish Straits under its civilian cover and was positioned within 12 hours of the recovery site. Webb flew into Istanbul on September 11th, traveling under a Canadian passport that identified him as a marine biologist named Robert McKinnon. He was met at the airport by a woman who introduced herself only as Sarah, and who drove him through the crowded streets to a marina on the Bosphorus where a small boat waited to ferry him to Atlantic Pioneer. The crossing took 8 hours through increasingly rough seas. Webb spent most of it in the vessel's small briefing room, studying everything American intelligence had been able to assemble about the target site. "We've conducted 3 passes with a towed sonar array," explained Lieutenant Commander Eric Torres, the mission's naval coordinator. "The object is approximately 8 meters long, with a diameter of roughly 50 centimeters at its widest point. Roughly 40% is visible above the sediment line. The remainder is buried." "Condition assessment?" "Unknown. The sonar returns suggest the outer casing is largely intact, but we won't know the full picture until you're down there." Torres hesitated. "There's something else." "Go on." Now, the last sonar pass, approximately 14 hours ago, detected what might be an acoustic anomaly emanating from the device. Webb felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of anomaly?" "Low-frequency mechanical vibration, consistent with either a functioning onboard system or—" Torres paused. "Or a damaged power source." "But you're telling me this thing might still be active?" "We're telling you we don't know, Chief. Soviet torpedo technology is largely a black box to us. We know they use a variety of propulsion systems and guidance mechanisms. Whether any of those systems could remain active after impact and weeks of submersion?" Torres shrugged. "Your guess is as good as ours." This was the moment, Webb later recalled, when he began to understand the true scope of what he was being asked to do. This wasn't a straightforward recovery operation. This was diving into Soviet territorial waters to examine a potentially active weapon system whose capabilities the entire American intelligence community admitted they didn't understand. But he was a Navy diver, and there was a mission to complete. The dive was scheduled for September 14th, timed to coincide with a period of minimal Soviet naval activity in the area. Intelligence indicated that most Black Sea Fleet vessels had returned to port, their crews uncertain whether they should be preparing for civil war or simply waiting for coherent orders that might never come. Webb's dive partner was Lieutenant James Harrington, a 31-year-old explosives ordnance disposal officer who had spent 3 years studying Soviet weapon systems. If anyone could assess whether the Shkval posed an immediate danger, it was Harrington. The 2 men had precisely 8 hours to work together before the dive, 8 hours to develop the kind of implicit communication and mutual trust that normally took months to establish. They spent most of that time in Atlantic Pioneer's equipment bay, checking and rechecking their diving apparatus, reviewing hand signals, and discussing contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine. "What happens if this thing is armed?" Webb asked during one of their final equipment checks. Harrington's response was characteristically deadpan. "Then we have a very interesting day, Chief." At 2:15 a.m. on September 14th, Webb and Harrington entered the water. The descent was conducted using a diving stage, a metal platform lowered from Atlantic Pioneer by crane, allowing the divers to conserve energy during the 97-meter drop to the seafloor. The water temperature decreased steadily as they descended, from a relatively comfortable 18 degrees Celsius at the surface to a bone-chilling 4 degrees at depth. Their breathing mixture was Trimix, a carefully calibrated combination of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium designed to prevent the nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity that would otherwise make diving at this depth impossible. Even with proper gas management, they would have limited time on the bottom, no more than 40 minutes before they would need to begin the lengthy decompression process required to return safely to the surface. At 90 meters, Webb activated his headlamp and swept the beam through the darkness below. The seafloor emerged gradually from the gloom, a flat, silty plain dotted with scattered rocks, and what appeared to be the remains of a long dead fishing net. And there, perhaps 20 meters ahead, was the Shkval. The torpedo was both larger and more alien-looking than Webb had anticipated. Its nose cone was buried in the sediment, leaving the after section angled upward at approximately 30 degrees. The external casing was covered in a complex array of fins, ports, and what appeared to be exhaust nozzles, unlike anything Webb had seen on Western torpedo designs. But it was the overall shape that struck him most forcefully. This wasn't a torpedo as he understood the term. It was more like a rocket with fins, a missile designed to fly through water rather than swim through it. Harrington moved forward first, approaching the weapon with the careful deliberation of someone fully aware that a single wrong move could be his last. Webb followed at a distance of 3 meters, his camera system active, recording every detail for the analysts who would spend months poring over the footage. And then Harrington stopped. Webb saw his partner's body go rigid, the unmistakable posture of sudden alarm. He moved forward, and as his own headlamp beam joined Harrington's on the torpedo's aft section, he understood why. Through a small observation port in the weapon's casing, a dim red light was blinking. The Shkval wasn't dead. Something inside was still functioning. For approximately 5 seconds, neither diver moved. The only sounds were the mechanical rhythm of their regulators and the distant hum of Atlantic Pioneer's engines on the surface far above. Then Webb heard the sound, a low bass vibration that seemed to emanate from the torpedo's interior, a mechanical heartbeat. Harrington turned to face Webb, his expression invisible behind his dive mask, but his body language unmistakably communicating. What now? The mission parameters were clear. Examine the device, photograph all external components, assess feasibility of recovery. But the parameters had not anticipated a potentially active weapon system with functioning internal components. Webb made the decision in a fraction of a second, the kind of split-second judgment that separates experienced divers from dead ones. He motioned for Harrington to continue the examination while maintaining maximum possible distance from the weapon. They would complete the photographic documentation, collect whatever external data they could, and then ascend to reassess. For the next 23 minutes, the two Americans conducted one of the most dangerous intelligence-gathering operations in Cold War history. Harrington worked methodically around the Shkval's exterior, photographing every component, every marking, every visible system. The Cyrillic text on the casing was photographed in detail. Classification stamps, manufacturing codes, and what appeared to be handling instructions. The distinctive rocket nozzle arrangement at the rear was documented from multiple angles, as were the unusual canard fins near the nose and the small ports along the weapon's body that would later be identified as part of the gas injection system that enabled supercavitation. Meanwhile, Webb focused on the sediment around the torpedo, searching for any debris that might have separated during impact. Approximately 4 meters from the main body, he discovered a fragment of metal approximately 12 centimeters long, apparently a piece of the guidance fin assembly that had sheared off when the weapon struck the seafloor. He collected the fragment in a mesh bag, knowing that even this small piece could provide invaluable metallurgical data to American analysts. Throughout the examination, the red light continued to blink. The mechanical hum continued to pulse. Neither diver allowed himself to think about what those signs might mean, about the possibility that they were conducting a close inspection of an armed nuclear warhead with a malfunctioning guidance system. At minute 27, Harrington signaled that he had completed his documentation. Webb responded with the assent signal. They had done everything the mission required. It was time to go. But as they turned to return to the diving stage, Webb saw something that made him pause. Partially buried in the sediment, approximately 8 meters from the torpedo, was what appeared to be a piece of metallic debris that had gone unnoticed during their initial survey. The object was larger than the fin fragment he had already collected, perhaps half a meter long, and appeared to have text or markings on its surface. Webb checked his air supply. 14 minutes of bottom time remaining before mandatory ascent. He made another split-second decision, one that would prove to be among the most consequential of the entire operation. He swam toward the debris. What Webb found buried in that sediment would ultimately prove more valuable than the torpedo itself. It was a section of the Shkval's outer casing that had separated during impact, a piece approximately 60 centimeters long and curved to match the weapon's cylindrical body. But more importantly, the fragment contained 3 separate manufacturing plates riveted to its interior surface. Those plates listed the weapon's complete technical specifications. Length 8,200 millimeters, diameter 533 millimeters, weight 2,700 kilograms, maximum speed 200 knots. Range, approximately 7,000 meters at full speed. Propulsion, solid fuel rocket motor with liquid gas injection supercavitation system. And there, at the bottom of the specification plate, was the designation that American intelligence had been hunting for, VA-111 Shkval. Webb photographed the plates from every possible angle, ensuring that each character was clearly visible, Then he carefully extracted the fragment from the sediment, secured it in his collection bag, and signaled Harrington that they were leaving. The ascent took 4 hours and 17 minutes. Decompression diving at depth requires a series of carefully timed stops to allow nitrogen to safely exit the body's tissues. Rush the process, and you risk decompression sickness, the bends, which can cause permanent paralysis or death. During those 4 hours, suspended at various depths in the cold, black sea water, Webb and Harrington had nothing to do but wait and think about what they had seen. When they finally surfaced alongside Atlantic Pioneer, the sun was rising over the Ukrainian coast to the northeast. The sea was calm. The ship's crew pulled them aboard with practiced efficiency, stripping off their diving equipment and rushing them to the hyperbaric chamber for additional decompression treatment. It was inside that chamber, 3 hours later, that David Callahan delivered the news that would define the operation's legacy. "The photographs you captured are unprecedented," the CIA officer said through the chamber's communication system. "The specification plates alone are worth more than 100 intelligence assets. But there's something else you need to know." Webb, exhausted beyond coherent thought but still functioning on pure adrenaline, raised his head. "What?" "While you were ascending, our acoustic monitoring detected increased activity from the torpedo. The mechanical signature has intensified significantly over the past 2 hours." "Meaning?" "Meaning our technical people believe the weapon's internal systems are degrading rapidly. The blinking light you observed may have been an indicator of battery failure or some kind of countdown sequence." "Countdown to what?" Callahan's pause lasted several seconds. "The Shkval's standard warhead configuration is a 210-kilogram high explosive charge. But there are intelligence reports, unconfirmed, that some variants were equipped with nuclear warheads." Webb felt his blood go cold. "You sent us down there next to a potentially nuclear weapon with failing systems?" "We sent you down there because we didn't know," Callahan replied. "And because if we didn't act when we had the chance, we might never understand what the Soviets had developed." The gamble paid off barely. 27 hours after Webb and Harrington completed their dive, the Shkval's acoustic signature went silent. American analysts believe the weapon's internal battery finally failed, shutting down whatever systems had remained active since the accident 3 weeks earlier. The torpedo itself remained on the seafloor, its recovery deemed too risky given the uncertain warhead status and the increasingly unstable political situation in Ukraine. But the intelligence Webb and Harrington gathered changed everything. When the specification plates were fully translated and analyzed, American naval engineers were confronted with technology they had confidently declared impossible just months earlier. The supercavitation system used principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about underwater hydrodynamics. The propulsion arrangement, a solid fuel rocket motor with integrated gas injection, represented engineering solutions American designers hadn't even considered attempting. Within weeks, the information was being shared at the highest levels of the American defense establishment. Within months, new research programs had been initiated to develop American supercavitation technology. Within years, those programs would produce experimental weapons that built directly on the principles Webb and Harrington had documented in those terrifying minutes on the floor of the Black Sea. But the implications extended far beyond American research laboratories. The discovery of the Shkval forced a fundamental reassessment of naval warfare doctrine. For decades, American aircraft carrier battle groups had operated under the assumption that their defensive systems could neutralize any incoming torpedo threat. The Shkval shattered that assumption. A weapon traveling at 200 knots leaves virtually no time for countermeasures. From detection to impact, a surface vessel might have 20 to 30 seconds to react. Far too little time for the complex defensive maneuvers and weapons deployment that traditional anti-torpedo doctrine required. Suddenly, the most powerful surface fleet in the world looked vulnerable. The strategic consequences were profound. American naval planners began developing new defensive concepts, new sensor systems, new countermeasure technologies, all driven by the need to address a threat they hadn't known existed, until 2 divers brought back photographs from the darkness of the Black Sea. For Marcus Webb, the mission's aftermath was both rewarding and frustrating. He received a classified commendation and an advancement in rank, but he was forbidden to discuss any aspect of the operation for the next 25 years. His contribution to American naval security remained hidden, known only to a small circle of intelligence professionals and defense officials. Harrington continued his career in explosive ordnance disposal, eventually retiring as a commander after 30 years of service. The 2 men remained in contact, bound by the shared experience of those 40 minutes on the seafloor, 40 minutes when they had quite literally changed the course of military history. And the Shkval itself? The torpedo remained on the Black Sea floor for years, gradually deteriorating as salt water and pressure took their toll. whether it was ever recovered by Russian forces, whether it was eventually destroyed in place, whether its nuclear warhead, if it had one, was safely neutralized. These questions remain classified to this day. What isn't classified is the weapon's legacy. The VA-111 Shkval represented one of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded military secrets, a breakthrough technology that demonstrated capabilities the West had believed impossible. Its accidental discovery during the chaotic final months of the Soviet state provided American intelligence with insights that shaped naval development for decades. But perhaps more importantly, the Shkval revealed something fundamental about the nature of technological competition. For all the billions of dollars the United States spent on military research, for all the sophisticated intelligence apparatus that monitored Soviet activities, this revolutionary weapon had developed and deployed without American knowledge. It was a reminder that adversaries are capable of surprises, that assumptions about what is and isn't possible can be catastrophically wrong. Commander Viktor Petrov, the submarine captain whose malfunctioning torpedo started this entire sequence of events, never faced prosecution for his actions during the coup attempt. The chaos of the Soviet collapse meant that many records were lost or destroyed, and Petrov himself retired quietly from the Russian Navy in 1994. In a 2012 interview for a Russian naval history magazine, he was asked about the events of August 1991 and the famous Shkval launch. His response was characteristically terse. "I followed my orders. What happened afterward is for historians to judge." Patricia Chen, the sonar analyst whose acoustic analysis first identified the Shkval's impossible speed, went on to become one of the Navy's leading experts in submarine warfare analysis. She retired in 2008 and now consults for defense contractors developing next-generation sonar systems. David Callahan left the CIA in 1997 and now runs a private security consulting firm that, according to public records, has contracts with multiple naval intelligence organizations. He has never spoken publicly about Operation Winter Harvest. As for the technology itself, supercavitating weapons have continued to develop. The United States eventually developed its own experimental systems, though none have entered operational service with the same specifications as the original Shkval. Russia continues to refine the design, with newer variants reportedly offering improved range and guidance capabilities. China, Iran, and Germany have all pursued similar technologies with varying degrees of success. But every one of these programs traces its lineage, directly or indirectly, to the breakthrough the Soviets achieved in the 1960s and 1970s, and to the intelligence bonanza that resulted from one malfunctioning torpedo and two American divers brave enough to approach it. The Shkval changed warfare not through combat, but through the fear of combat, through the recognition that established assumptions about underwater weapons could be fundamentally wrong. It forced militaries around the world to rethink their defensive strategies, their research priorities, and their understanding of what was technically possible. And all of it started with a test firing during a failed coup, a malfunctioning guidance system, and 37 minutes of pure terror on the floor of the Black Sea. Some discoveries happen in laboratories, through careful research and methodical experimentation. Others happen in darkness, at 97 meters depth, when a diver's headlamp falls on something that shouldn't exist. The recovery of the VA-111 Shkval belongs to the second category, a reminder that the most important secrets are sometimes found in the most dangerous places, by people willing to descend into the unknown. The divers surfaced, the intelligence flowed, and naval warfare was never quite the same. But here's what the official reports never mention: the human cost that no declassified document captures. Marcus Webb never slept soundly again. For years after Operation Winter Harvest, he would wake in the early morning hours, convinced he could hear that low mechanical hum, the pulse of the Shkval's failing systems reverberating through his memory. The sound had lasted perhaps 40 minutes in reality, but it echoed through his dreams for decades. He told a journalist in 2018, speaking for the first time publicly about his experiences, "People ask me if I was scared down there. Scared doesn't begin to cover it. There's a difference between danger and the unknown. Danger you can assess, plan for, mitigate. The unknown just sits there, waiting." And yet, when asked if he regretted the mission, Webb's answer was immediate. "Not for a second. We learned something that changed how we protect our sailors, our ships, our country. The fear was worth it. The fear was necessary." Lieutenant Harrington expressed similar sentiments in a rare interview given shortly before his death in 2019. "I've thought about those minutes every day since September 1991, he said. "Every single day. But I also know that what we brought back saved lives, maybe thousands of lives. Because the ships we built after, the defenses we developed, the training we implemented, all of it came from understanding what we were up against." He paused, his eyes focused on something far away. "That red light blinking in the darkness. I can still see it. I'll see it until the day I die." The human stories behind technological breakthroughs are often lost to history, classified away, or simply forgotten as the machinery of progress rolls forward. But behind every weapons system, behind every defensive capability, behind every strategic doctrine, there are people who took risks that can barely be comprehended. Marcus Webb and James Harrington didn't design the American response to supercavitating weapons. They didn't build the defensive systems or write the tactical manuals, but they provided the foundation, the raw knowledge upon which everything else was built. And they did it 40 minutes at a time, in absolute darkness, next to a device that could have ended their lives in a fraction of a second. There's a plaque at the Naval Amphibious Base in Little Creek, Virginia, installed in 2016. It doesn't mention Operation Winter Harvest by name. The classification restrictions still apply. It simply reads, "In honor of those who descended into darkness so that others might sail in light." Webb attended the dedication ceremony. Harrington was too ill to travel. But when a photograph of the plaque was sent to him, he reportedly held it for a long time before saying, "That's exactly right. That's exactly what we did." The Shkval Torpedo sits somewhere in Russian naval archives today, either the original weapon from B-871's fateful launch, or one of the hundreds of others manufactured in the decades since. Its distinctive silhouette represents one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the Cold War era. But for two American divers, it represents something more. It represents the moment when curiosity outweighed fear, when duty overcame survival instinct, and when 40 minutes of terror on the seafloor changed the course of military history. What they found changed warfare, but it also changed them. And perhaps that's the truest measure of any discovery, not just what it reveals about the world, but what it demands from those who make it. The water is dark at 97 meters, but sometimes looking into that darkness is the only way to see what's really there. They looked, they documented, they surfaced, and nothing was ever the same again. The discovery forced a painful reassessment, not just of naval capabilities, but of intelligence capabilities. How had such a significant program remained hidden? What else might be out there, waiting to be discovered? For naval strategists, the implications were immediately practical. If the Soviets had supercavitating torpedoes, how do you defend against them? Traditional anti-torpedo defenses relied on several layers of protection. First, detect the incoming weapon using sonar. Second, maneuver the ship to minimize the probability of impact. Third, deploy countermeasures to confuse or destroy the threat. Against a conventional torpedo traveling at 50 knots, this defensive sequence might take 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Against a Shkval traveling at 200 knots, you had perhaps 30 seconds total. That's not enough time to implement any defensive protocol. That's barely enough time to issue a warning. The American response was multifaceted. At the tactical level, new emphasis was placed on detecting and tracking submarine threats before they could reach launch range. The philosophy shifted from survive the attack to prevent the attack. At the technical level, research programs were accelerated to develop hard-kill anti-torpedo systems capable of physically destroying incoming weapons regardless of their speed. At the strategic level, the Shkval's existence forced a fundamental reconsideration of surface fleet vulnerability. Aircraft carriers, those floating symbols of American power projection, suddenly looked more fragile. All of this stemmed from 40 minutes on the seafloor, one malfunctioning torpedo, and two divers willing to approach the unknown. The Shkval taught American strategists to question their assumptions. It taught American engineers to consider unconventional approaches. It taught American intelligence officers to look harder at the things they thought they understood. And it taught two American divers that the deepest secrets are often found in the darkest places, and that bringing them to light requires a willingness to face the unknown. September 14th, 1991, 97 meters below the surface of the Black Sea, a red light blinking in the darkness, a mechanical hum pulsing through the water, and two men deciding, against every survival instinct, to move closer. That decision changed warfare. But more than that, it revealed something about human nature, about the drive to understand, to discover, to illuminate what has been hidden. That drive has powered every scientific breakthrough, every technological advancement, every expansion of human knowledge throughout history. Webb and Harrington weren't scientists. They weren't engineers. They were operational personnel, trained to execute missions regardless of personal risk. But in those 40 minutes on the seafloor, they were doing something fundamentally scientific, observing the unknown, documenting what they found, bringing evidence back to the surface where it could be analyzed and understood. The Shkval's discovery was an accident, a malfunctioning guidance system, a submarine captain's nervous test firing, a sonar technician's sharp ears. But what happened afterward was deliberate. A decision was made to investigate, a mission was planned, risks were accepted. And when Webb and Harrington descended into the darkness, they were carrying more than cameras and collection bags. They were carrying the cumulative curiosity of an entire civilization, the same drive that had sent humans to the moon, that had split the atom, that had mapped the human genome. The drive to know. The underwater world keeps its secrets well. Pressure, darkness, cold, all conspire to hide what lies beneath the surface. But humans have always found ways to descend, to explore, to bring back what we find. The VA-111 Shkval was hidden in the darkness of the Black Sea for exactly 20 days before American divers reached it. In that time, the Soviet Union as a political entity effectively ceased to exist. The world was transforming in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. And yet, even amid that historical earthquake, the drive to understand persisted. A weapon system was malfunctioning on the seafloor, and someone decided it was worth the risk to find out why. That decision, more than any technological specification, more than any intelligence assessment, more than any strategic implication, is what makes the Shkval story worth telling. It's a reminder that knowledge is never free. It has to be sought, or risked for, earned. Webb and Harrington earned it. And the rest of us benefit from their courage. When Marcus Webb retired from the Navy in 1998, he had accumulated over 4,000 hours of underwater operations time. He had conducted recovery missions on 4 continents. He had helped develop new diving techniques that extended human capabilities to depths previously thought impossible. But when asked about his most significant contribution, he always came back to one mission. Everything changed after that dive, he said in his 2018 interview. Not just for me personally, though it did change me, but for the entire Navy. We understood something we hadn't understood before. We saw something we hadn't been allowed to see. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. That's what diving is really about, I think. Not the depth, not the danger, not the technical challenges. It's about seeing what's hidden. It's about bringing back knowledge from places most people can't go. He smiled slightly. The Shkval was a weapon, a dangerous weapon. But what we learned from it made us stronger, made our defenses better, made our sailors safer. Another pause. That's worth the fear. That's worth everything. James Harrington, in his final interview before his death, was asked a similar question. His answer was characteristically brief. We did our job. We saw something important. We reported what we found. He was asked if he had any regrets. Only one, he said. I wish we could have stayed down there longer. There was so much more to see. The Shkval rests somewhere in history now, either on the seafloor where Commander Petrov's malfunctioning launch deposited it, or in some Russian military archive, or perhaps destroyed and scattered in atoms that once composed one of the Cold War's most closely guarded secrets. But its legacy endures. Every time an American warship deploys with anti-torpedo countermeasures, every time a submarine hunter-killer group practices procedures designed to engage threats before launch, every time an engineer works on next-generation underwater weapon systems, every time someone asks, what else don't we know? The Shkval's legacy endures. And so does the legacy of 2 men who descended into darkness because someone had to know what was down there. They found a weapon that changed warfare. They brought back knowledge that protected their nation. They faced the unknown and refused to blink. That's the real story of the VA-111 Shkval. Not just a technological breakthrough, not just an intelligence coup, not just a strategic revelation. A human story. About courage, about curiosity, about the willingness to descend into places where you might not survive, and about what you find when you get there. September 14th, 1991, 3:47 a.m., 43 nautical miles northwest of Sevastopol. The water is dark at 97 meters. But sometimes looking into that darkness is the only way to see. Webb and Harrington looked, and what they found changed everything.